and then
Welcome everyone that's joined so far. We will get started in just a few minutes. Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Kennedy, President of the Board of Directors for the Bay Planning Coalition, and I would like to welcome you all to our 2021 Spring Summit. As we come together for our second virtual conference, we are grappling with the dramatic and uneven toll this pandemic has inflicted on our lives and our economy. On top of that, over the past year, we've experienced extraordinary climate threats, the worst wildfires in California history, hazardous air quality, and now we're in one of the driest years on record. Climate change is no longer a future threat, it's here now. While 2020 was the year of crises, we are hopeful that 2021 will be the year of solutions. We are fortunately starting to see political momentum to invest in projects to protect our people, infrastructure, and environment from climate threats. Today, we are honored to host federal, state, and regional leaders to explore how we can implement projects to address our climate crises. I want to give a special thank you to our generous sponsors, especially our hosting sponsor, Cargill. You can see all of our many generous sponsors on the screen now. And if you are not already a member of BPC, we encourage you to get involved in one of our many policy and regulatory activities, because our broad coalition is strengthened by the many diverse viewpoints and experiences in the room today. Now, I'd like to introduce BPC's Vice President, Jacqueline Newsty.
Hello. As Laura said, this is the first time we're seeing such a strong political appetite to prioritize resilient infrastructure projects at both the federal and the state level. This really is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to attract significant new funding to deliver key climate adaptation and transportation infrastructure to the Bay Area. But we have to act quickly to turn that money into solutions before it's too late to adapt to the changing climate. That's why Bay Planning Coalition has been working with our public agency partners to speed up planning and permitting for resiliency projects. At today's Spring Summit, we will be exploring how the Bay Area and the nation at large can quickly plan, fund, and implement key resilient infrastructure projects that will also jumpstart our post-COVID economic recovery. We are honored to have our opening keynote speaker today with us, Controller Betty Yee, who will help set the tone of the Spring Summit by sharing her vision for future climate and economic resilience in California. Following Ms. Yee, we're going to take a high-level view with a federal-specific infrastructure update with Eric Saperstein. Then we're going to have a moderated panel discussing planning and funding projects for a more resilient region. The panel will include viewpoints from federal, state, and local representatives. After the panel, all attendees are invited to select and join one of our 4 breakout sessions that will focus discussion on prioritizing our resilient infrastructure investments. This is where we need input from you, all of our members and our guests. So we encourage you to participate in these breakout rooms and share your topical expertise and opinions, because we know you have it. The breakout rooms will be available on the topics of sea level rise, water, transportation, and ports and airports. After the sessions, we will reconvene as a large group and present the key points that were discussed in each of the 4 sessions. This morning is going to be full of important and urgently relevant information to our region, and we are so happy you decided to join us and participate. So let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Rick Notini to introduce our first speaker. Rick is a longtime BPC board member and the Land Resources Manager at Cargill.
Good morning. Thank you for the introducing our first key speaker. Betty Yee is the State Controller of California and serves as the Chief Fiscal Officer for the 5th largest economy in the world. She's been the Controller since 2015, following 2 terms of service on the State Board of Equalization. She's only the 10th woman in California history to be elected to statewide office and has long been committed to supporting women and others from diverse communities who pursue careers in public service. She's a native of San Francisco, a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and has a master's degree in public administration. Ms. Yee serves on dozens of boards and commissions with authority ranging from land management to crime victim compensation. And as one of 3 commissioners on the State Lands Commission, she helps provide stewardship of public trust lands, waterways, industrial wharves, marine terminals, pipelines, and resources through economic development, protection, preservation, and restoration consistent with the state's environmental needs. All of these are issues of keen interest to the Bay Planning Coalition. Most recently, under her leadership on the State Lands Commission, the commission unanimously adopted its 2021 to 2025 strategic plan. And this plan addresses key issues including public access, climate change, sea level rise, environmental justice, tribal relations, sustainable economic development, and environmental protection. And I'm hoping today that she will share some of her insights from all of the work she's been doing on these issues that are of great interest to the Bay Planning Coalition. So welcome, Controller Yee.
Thank you very much, Rick, for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I first just want to say thank you for the work of the Bay Planning Coalition, which is so timely with respect to the resources that are available to hopefully help us move California and certainly our Bay region forward with respect to so many of the issues that Rick and Jacqueline and Laura have enumerated. I wanted to first just say, you gave me a task of laying out a vision for future climate and economic resilience in California. No pressure, I know, but it is something that I actually care very deeply about. And as Rick suggested in terms of my service to the state, this is a theme that intersects almost everything that I do, whether it's on our nation's two largest public pension boards, to our work on the State Lands Commission. But first, what I wanted to do is just to talk a little bit about the economics of what we're dealing with in the Bay Area, something that I think does provide a little bit of level setting with regard to why I believe the Bay Area will be the leader with respect to defining what climate and economic resilience looks like for the rest of California and possibly even throughout the world. You know, as we looked at certainly the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, I don't think there is any day that goes by where we are not pointing to a lesson or two, or maybe even more than that, that is guiding our work today. And that is certainly true with respect to the work that I continue to do as your CFO. You know, as I also think about this time, unprecedented time of where we have significant federal fiscal resources as well as state fiscal resources, there are tremendous opportunities that we have the ability to undertake and hopefully be guided by a vision that speaks to where we want to see ourselves and all of our diverse communities in the long term. So let me just start by saying that, you know, with respect to the state of California's economy, we are starting to bounce back. And I think we're all witnessing some of that in our own communities where so many of our shuttered businesses are reopening, companies are hiring, and we are also seeing a lot of focus on just how we're going to continue to keep people healthy and safe as we try to reach the other side of this pandemic. Vaccinations are keeping on pace, and so we are all very, very optimistic at the state that we are going to see a close to full reopening on June 15th. You know, from a revenue perspective, I think I do need to say this, it is making my job easy when we see such unprecedented levels of revenue coming to the state of California, but it also speaks to an underlying structural issue, and that is California really represents the tale of two cities. The reason we have such overwhelming additional revenue coming in above projections is because those who are earning more and the most are doing very well. And we know what's happened to the rest of our workforce during this pandemic, and hopefully they will be back in jobs that provide quality livelihoods very, very soon. So now 10 months into the fiscal year, total revenues are about 30% higher than projected in the enacted budget for this current fiscal year. Quite unbelievable. It is, and that's around $36 billion higher. We will continue to track that to see exactly what the legislature has to work with going into the budget for the next fiscal year. We also know that the Bay Area really led California with respect to the economy and our economic activity here in California. Our current unemployment rate is still remains at about 8.3%, and but we are continuing to add new jobs every month. And so we hope that this trend continues and that we can see that rate go down. with respect to the Bay Area, this is where all 9 counties in the Bay Area have lower unemployment rates than the rest of the state. With Alameda County 6.3, Contra Costa 6.6, Marin 4.5. I mean, we just look on and on and on, and the Bay Area clearly is what is leading, the recovery. And it's also unique because with our tech companies and certainly our position as a hub for international goods movement through our ports, the Central Valley distribution centers, also transportation arteries, this really has helped us avoid some of the worst economic impacts during the COVID crisis. We did certainly have impacts, but certainly not as dire as some other parts of the state. In the governor's May revision of the budget, I'm happy to say that we were quite instrumental in having $250 million of the federal allocation from the American Rescue Act to California be directed to our ports in California, who really have just been so much more than ports during the pandemic. They've been vaccination sites. They have also provided temporary shelter for some of our homeless population. It is just something that we believe that certainly with the businesses around the ports and the maritime industry suffering, that these are dollars that are going to be much needed for economic recovery here in California. So the one thing I want to just say about just how I look at the vision for climate and economic resilience in California is truly from the lessons that we've learned from this COVID crisis. Now, combating the pandemic, certainly first and foremost, California has really had to focus on, and rightly focus on, the health crisis itself and also how we save lives. And I think the lasting issue of saving livelihoods is something that is going to need to be a theme when we talk about any kind of climate and economic resilience. Oftentimes when we talk about this, we tend to not talk about the human capital aspect of recovery and how we grow the economy. And I know that I just see tremendous opportunity when we look at how we address all of our climate impacts to also look at how we grow the economy. And as we have seen with the green sector of our economy, and certainly in the renewable energy space, we are able to be environmentally responsible as well as growing the economy at the same time. But one of the things that the COVID crisis did unveil, finally, and I think we all knew it intuitively, but it is now really stark for all to see, is that even before the pandemic, our inequality here in California among our workers was just quite stark. We had about 1/3 of our workforce who were making $15 an hour or less prior to the pandemic, many of them holding college degrees. And we also have the highest rate of poverty when we look at the rising cost of living, and too many workers are left without critical protections and safety net services. And so obviously the early responses to COVID was to be sure that people could stay in their homes and also be able to stay healthy and safe. But I think we have a significant role in terms of looking at how we, what I call future-proof our economy, and also generate good paying jobs and sustainable work, rather than returning to the vulnerable economy of 2019, whose foundation really rested on the less than robust financial health of our workers in California. And I know many of you, and particularly I thank you to all the sponsors of this event, that many of you are very familiar with the concept of future proofing, obviously long a term in the industrial design space, and really applied to minimize the shocks and stresses of anticipated events, but more so now, including the application of this concept to climate change. And when we look at just the economic shocks and stresses of this COVID-19 pandemic, which have been vast, still every day reveals new lessons for how California can better prepare to tackle known and unforeseeable challenges in the future. And that's what I believe climate change, all the impacts that we're experiencing with climate change are about. We talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't believe that will be the last pandemic that we are going to experience. This will require, as we look at incorporating kind of this future-proofing concept, risk intelligent leadership, long-term planning, which the coalition has been very, very instrumental in engaging in, as well as short-term actions, dedication to reducing vulnerability and building resiliency, and creativity in how we utilize our physical, our financial, and our human resources. And all of this executed with discipline and influenced by science and data. And as I think about just what is so critical in terms of building this climate and economic resilience, I think one of the things that I think about the most through my service on the various boards and commissions is how we protect our human and physical capital, our natural capital. You know, we have had just found ourselves a little ill-prepared for this pandemic. I don't think anyone anticipated that it would hit as hard in California, but also happened on the heels of some of the worst wildfire years that we've had in California history. And so here we can look at, as we reopen the economy, that some of the pre-COVID conditions hopefully will also be addressed, that it's not just about returning to where we were, but that we are moving even further with respect to addressing the vulnerabilities that we had prior to COVID-19. So I believe that future-proofing California's economy must include the hardening of our public health infrastructure, obviously, but preparing for a more expansive workforce, improving information systems, and upgrading just all of the infrastructure attendant to really promoting everyone's health. But it is also the experiences offered by the wildfire devastation that we've seen since 2017 has also heightened attention about the need to harden fire prevention and suppression capabilities, as well as to take on the new normal of weather creating wildfires and other climate-related events. We have 33 million acres of forest lands here in California, much of them devastated by droughts and wildfires in recent years. And so investing in forest management can help protect the 11 million Californians living in harm's way, and also improving air quality and advancing our carbon goals and other climate benefits. So this is just an example of how, as we look at these issues, we hope to be achieving multiple objectives with where we are going to be placing our attention and our resources, but also as we look at moving forward, what does this mean for Californians themselves relative to being residents of these affected areas? And more importantly, what does it mean for Californians with respect to being participants in our economy going forward? When I look at also other impacts, certainly sea level rise, there is much work to be done there. And as we look at just all of the things attendant to what is going to happen relative to the impacts of sea level rise, again, there is an aspect of this that can speak to the kinds of jobs that we need to ready ourselves from the impacts of sea level rise, and also begin to look at some of the most vulnerable communities that are going to be affected by those effects. You know, the governor has been very generous in the climate space in his May revision to the budget. And you know, as I think about just the investments that he's made, looking at about $211 million in the May revision to protect communities from sea level rise and flooding through coastal wetland restoration and resilience measures. I just want to note that this is a historic level of funding. We don't know whether this funding is going to be ongoing, but I do think it is an investment. And what we should be looking at and how we should be looking at funding at this point is really how to leverage that more so that we can get more impact. We can hopefully affect more communities, and also look at how hopefully this can spur other investment for the long term as well. You know, at the State Lands Commission, we're incorporating strategies to address climate change, and obviously adapting to sea level rise is a big part of that. But we're also having to consider tough trade-offs, such as the balance between investment and risk, and or retrofitting or new building. And it's a time of where at times this might mean managed retreat, the purposeful movement of infrastructure inland, rather than fighting a losing struggle against an encroaching ocean. So these are all the tough choices that all of you are familiar with. And I guess my message to you in terms of the vision is, let's not have just the abundance of funding, just have us look at the short term, how we're going to utilize that funding, but also think about the long term in terms of where we want to see ourselves 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. And this is extremely hard to do when the needs are so great. but it is essential to do because I also believe, having been your CFO since 2015, that our resources are becoming much more finite. Our physical resources, our financial resources, and really where I believe we have an abundance of resources still yet to be tapped is in our human capital, which is why I think part of economic resilience has to be about investing in our workers, and certainly education is a big part of that, and continuing to have investments in education in our annual budget, but also looking at the specific needs of our most vulnerable communities and our most disproportionately affected communities as well. The budget also includes funding for drought infrastructure and preparedness as well. And one thing I will say about just the abundance of dollars that are coming to California is, from my perspective, relief and assistance aren't necessarily permanent solutions. And they're exactly that, relief and assistance. So we're dealing with both the critical current needs as well as looking at how we're going to leverage these dollars to deal with the long-term effects as well. And the long-term effect, including how we rebuild an economy that is resilient and that does move us further along in terms of being able to address some of the climate impacts that we are already experiencing. So I want to just turn some attention to some work that I've been doing since last year. And it began really at the beginning of the pandemic, and just seeing how some of our diverse communities have been the most severely affected. And it is something that I know all of you are sensitive to, and it's something that I believe is essential if we are going to talk about attaining climate and economic resilience. And that is really paying attention to what's happening in our minority communities, our low-income communities, our disproportionately affected communities. It is the pandemic, and certainly the urgent focus on economic recovery is provides a tremendous opportunity for us to incorporate that lens through everything that we're doing. We know that, for example, the Latinx community has been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also with respect to access to vaccines. And yet we also know that some of the funding decisions of the past and policy decisions of the past have essentially just shifted the burden to some of these communities. And so we have to be just smarter, and hopefully scrutinize a lot more of our actions to be sure that the impacts are not being borne by communities that have traditionally had to bear these impacts. So eliminating adverse and environmental and economic impacts, building resiliency to better prepare for and endure future social, economic, and environmental shocks and stresses, ensuring strong, lasting economic recovery that is mindful to avoid displacement, reducing disparities, promoting economic inclusion. All of these things have to be part of any solutions that we embrace with respect to building climate resilience. This is how we're going to build economic resilience. And it's also the way we're going to help some of the most disproportionately affected communities build resilience themselves within their own communities. And I believe this is imperative. I also think it's very possible, and I do think that is our calling. So we can go back to decision-making as we have known it prior to the pandemic, but I think that we know a lot more now about where some of the stresses are, and where some of the disproportionate impacts are, and where some of the risks are going to be in the future. And I hope that guides all of our work as we continue to look at how we put together a plan and an economy, and certainly a state and this region that is going to be more resilient. Lastly, let me just say some things that I'm really excited about, and this speaks to California and why I believe we are going to continue to be leaders, not just in this nation, but around the world, relative to how we're going to do this work. As I mentioned earlier, we have some unique attributes in the Bay Area that lead me to believe that the Bay Area will lead California in this work. But as we have already seen relative to emerging industries in California, we have seen certainly the emergence of the green sectors of our economy, and California has been leading in renewable energy, and certainly in renewable energy jobs. We also are seeing much more prominence with respect to the development of the blue sector of our economy. And particularly as we are looking at our oceans and waterways, and as being more and more a source of not only just economic activity relative to tourism, which is typically how we've thought about these areas economically, but also as increasingly reliant on these resources for food, for energy, for scientific research, and for transportation. And as I think about all of these areas, I also think about how jobs can be developed that are going to provide some pretty healthy livelihoods for those working in these sectors of the economy. And these are areas that already are gaining global prominence, and California, particularly in some of the port areas of our state, have been leaders in many of these areas. And so I'm hopeful that we will continue to be, and also make our mark globally relative to the emergence of these sectors. We also have seen that as we do this work, that we keep very much intact our commitment to the health of our ocean and waterways. This is something that is a value in California, and it will not be compromised as we continue to do our work. And I know that your planning is very much mindful of that goal. And so here we have in California, I think, just some unique opportunities. And as I like to say to my team, we're responsible for pushing dollars out the door, for getting checks into the hands of the right recipients. And as I think about our increased workload in that regard, I also think about how I hope this is not one time in nature, that as we are doing this, and I was just with my mail and print team a couple days ago, as we talked about how they're going to be faced with a huge volume of Golden State stimulus checks going out to our most vulnerable Californians, and how proud they are to be doing this work so that they can help the most vulnerable of our neighbors. What is not lost on them is that this may only be a one-time kind of an event. And that as we do this, what's going to happen with respect to how we ensure that these communities continue to be included in all that we do to lift up our economy, and certainly to address our climate impacts. And so I'll conclude by saying that we have the daunting challenge of dealing with how to make decisions and guide short-term actions, while at the same time looking at how we build a vision that helps Californians and certainly those of us in the Bay Area really see what our communities and our economy can look like going forward. And I do hope that as we do this work together, that we do it with the value of being inclusive. We do it with the value of understanding that our economy is only as strong as the ability of everyone to really have strong livelihoods and quality jobs. And we do this also with the value that here in California, we do respect the tremendous diversity that we see, not just among our people, but certainly among our lands and among our talent throughout California. And, you know, I'll just say one other thing that I believe can be really transformative. All of us have been really made more mindful, particularly living in the Bay Area, of an issue that I will be spending a lot of time on before I leave this office at the end of next year, and that is marine plastics pollution. It is a global crisis. It is an area that I believe, again, California can lead in, and not just looking at it from the perspective of policies like eliminating single-use plastics, but which has been the policy, but being more bold in our thinking and really having strategies around how we can look at increasing the markets for recycled materials, and addressing the just the reality that plastics are entering our natural environments. It's actually gotten worse since the COVID-19 crisis, with new products entering into our waterways. But as we look at increasing recycling, reducing reliance on single-use plastic products, which is the current policy, we have to be more bold with respect to how we look at our economy leading others in terms of creating markets for recycled materials and other prospective sectors to cure this problem. So these are the kinds of things that I think we need to step into. So it's not just solving for the current crisis, it is looking at how we are going to continue to build our economy, based on resilience, based on inclusion. And I know all of us here, and I know the Bay Planning Bay Planning Coalition has been so immersed in all of these issues. And I really look forward to our partnership together as we continue to look at the policies that are going to bring California into the forefront of all of these issues across this nation and around the globe. So I guess my parting words would just be, don't squander this opportunity. And it is a tremendous opportunity. We have historic levels of funding. They're not investments yet, but I think as I said, relief and assistance are not permanent solutions. They become permanent solutions when we have a strategy and vision. And I think that is why I just applaud the work of the Bay Planning Coalition and look forward to our work together on this front. So thank you for having me. And I hope this has provided a little bit of, hopefully a little bit of inspiration for the day's work.
Thank you, Controller Yee. And thank you for sharing your vision, or a vision for climate and economic resilience, opportunities for future-proofing our economy, and ways that the Bay Area can lead this work. Next up, we'll hear a political update from Washington about the federal infrastructure negotiations in Congress before diving deeper into this topic on the panel that follows. President Biden recently announced the American Jobs Plan, which provides historic investments in strengthening the nation's infrastructure. And just last week, U.S. Transportation Secretary Buttigieg's budget proposal included a similar focus on tackling our climate crisis. Joining us today to elaborate on this federal funding outlook is Eric Saperstein, founder and president of ENS Resources, a legislative and regulatory affairs consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. Prior to founding ENS Resources, Eric worked at the EPA and has been a recognized leader in environmental protection and innovative energy policy. Thank you for being here, Eric.
Well, thank you, Laura, and to the Bay Planning Coalition leadership. Thank you for the opportunity, and John Coleman also, to participate in what I hope will be the last virtual Spring Summit for BPC. And if I could go off script, Laura, for a second, I just wanted to say I was so delighted to hear Controller Yee's comments, but at the end, particularly the commitment to dealing with marine pollution, which I think is one of the key issues of the future and is here and now. Okay, so spoiler alert. This is going to be an optimistic outlook, despite the past years of gridlock in Congress. Politics is the art of the doable. And I think that from a perspective of what is going on in Washington right now, members in Congress want to do something on infrastructure. So I'm going to provide an update on where the infrastructure policy debate is today and what the prospects are for enactment later this year. So what is clearly a work in progress, we're going to review the factors influencing the process and where we'll end up. Now, so today I would suggest to you the infrastructure effort is a little bit like the situation with the Evergreen freighter found itself stuck in the Suez Canal several months ago. It's going to take some time to resolve the blockages that are slowing progress on infrastructure policymaking. But at the end of the day, we're going to see, like the Evergreen, the matters get resolved, we'll break through the muck, if you will, and have an infrastructure package sent to the president's desk. But really, the prominent issue for us really is how big this package is going to be. It will be close to the $2.3 trillion of the president's request of the American Job Plan, or will it be closer to a $900 billion number that the Senate Republicans put out there? All of this is going to be driven by three factors, I believe. First, what's the philosophy of a national infrastructure program as defined by the administration? I would say that it's a couple of things. First of all, it's modernize investments, not just throw money at projects to rebuild past decades of infrastructure. In other words, position the nation to compete domestically and internationally in the 21st century as technology and capacity for technology becomes vital to successful economies. The second thing to consider is addressing our infrastructure to tackle climate impacts, from sea level rise to drought to clean energy needs. That's the other, shall we call it, philosophical issue that the White House has put forward. And then lastly, as Controller Yee identified, target resources to address the underserved areas, the disadvantaged communities, that have not been sharing in the past efforts on an equity basis of dealing with infrastructure needs. So I think these are the core elements of the administration's position that have been central to the ongoing discussions with the Senate Republicans specifically, and will be happening again today to find a, shall we call it, a common ground if possible to do a bipartisan agreement. The second issue is how can the White House and Congress basically resolve a number of key overriding issues that embody how infrastructure assistance is targeted. First and foremost, paying for the package. Will we have tax increases, which the Republicans have drawn a line in the sand saying no? Will we do deficit spending as opposed to raising taxes? Or, as the Republicans most recently suggested, repackage unobligated or unspent COVID disaster assistance, including limited new spending and most likely through deficit spending. So that's the first issue that's driving as far as getting to a specific resolution. The second thing is, how are we going to define infrastructure? Are we going to basically rebuild bricks and mortar projects? Or are we going to expand what would be defined as infrastructure, investing in human infrastructure to deliver a talented pool of workers capable of responding to the pressing needs that are becoming increasingly self-evident by climate impacts and closing the economic, shall we say, opportunity gaps that were most revealed during the pandemic of the past year and a half. And finally, the issue of improving industrial manufacturing base. This has been a big deal for the White House and for the campaign for the presidency by Biden. Will we have infrastructure investments done by incentives, or will we have Buy American mandates on all elements of infrastructure assistance as a condition to secure federal assistance? These issues loom large. And we'll have to see whether it's a carrot, a stick, or a hybrid approach that will be put in place to stand up a robust manufacturing base that will provide for continued economic expansion for all. Third, if the most important of all issues can be resolved, what's the pathway for enactment? As of now, we're stuck, I think, watching what I call a kabuki dance between the Senate Republicans and the White House. You see that playing out in the newspapers and on the news every night. In my humble opinion, this is just political theater. I hope I'm wrong, but it's difficult to see how you square the gulf between the two sides related to taxes, raising or not raising them, and the funding levels of 2.3 trillion versus the Senate Republican position of 900 billion. We'll see if bipartisan deal making can come together in the next, call it 72 hours or so, because that seems what they're headed towards, making a deal or no deal, or as they're saying recently, fish or cut bait time. But if a bipartisan deal making does fall through, there are two other approaches that could be pursued. The first is that we have individual bills running through both the House and Senate dealing with transportation and water system needs. They could form the basis of small bore efforts to do infrastructure investment. And if they decide in the House to move a big package through and throw it to the Senate to deal with it, you could see the filibuster proof or filibuster breaking opportunity of eliminating debate, but using reconciliation with a 50 vote margin plus one, calling it a victory or no victory. In the end, I'm optimistic that we'll have a package. We've been holding Infrastructure Week for more than a decade or so, and no one, quite frankly, is against infrastructure. They're just against, or disagreement, shall we say, on funding levels and where we put the bulk of the money. The House will move an infrastructure bill, according to the Speaker, by July 4th. And that will mean the Senate will be the focus of all attention over the summer and into the fall. So after a decade of talking about infrastructure, we're at a point where everyone agrees we must do something. And the most important piece of the debate is, how will we deliver something to the president? And like the evergreen situation, by late fall, we expect the disputes and the debates over the nature and breadth of a policy to be unstuck and decided on what the course of action will be. And then I think we will see, even from a position of BPC interest, increased federal investments in ports, harbors, roads, bridges, and water systems that should become the law of the land by November at the latest. So I'm optimistic, And I look forward to all those funds going forward and rebuilding our country to meet the future needs of the nation, both current and the future generations. So thank you again for the opportunity to present today, and I wish you the best for a successful conference.
Thank you for that comprehensive update, Eric. And that overview sets the tone for our panel, where our speakers will analyze how to attract new federal and state funding to quickly deliver resilient infrastructure projects in the Bay Area. John King is moderating the panel. John is the urban design critic for the San Francisco Chronicle, where he covers sea level rise and regional planning. His work has received awards from the California chapters of the American Institute of Architects and the American Planning Association. I will turn it over to John to introduce our speakers. And thank you for joining us today, John.
Thank you very much. I apologize. I'm having some, of course, computer problems because it's a Zoom thing. So that is what we do. Okay. It's been a long day already. Okay, great. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to get this a little bit bigger so I can see. Okay, I'm going to shift it over here and I'll look better on the next round. I really want to apologize. This actually is coinciding with a large package of mine on sea level rise and how the Bay Area prepares and adapts to that, which of course is the huge issue that we're going to be touching on along with everything else about resiliency. And it is something I am, for those of you who know my work, I am the urban design critic, a lot of which involves architecture, landscape architecture, planning, things like that. And what drew me into this years ago is just realizing that the whole issue of climate change is a planning issue. We have to figure out how to get in advance and how to not just agree that climate change is an issue, but think about how the Bay Area can take advantage of the time we have now to lay the groundwork to adapt in a way that'll work out. And so when I was asked to moderate the panel today, I was very happy to say yes, because it's such an important topic and this is such a great panel to work with. And I also appreciate how the Bay Planning Coalition over the years has kept on this. So I will be having a conversation at the end with the three presenters today, all of whom are terrific. And first we will be hearing from Congressman DeSaulnier, who you and I know him as the former head of the great TR's restaurant in Concord near the downtown square, but he has since gone on to even greater accomplishments. He is the 6-year representative of the 11th Congressional District after serving on the State Assembly and in the State Senate. And he is one of the few Congress representatives who is on 4 committees, including the all-important House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. After that, we'll be hearing from Assemblymember Kevin Mullen, who currently is the Speaker Pro Tem of the State Assembly. He is the former mayor of South San Francisco and almost promoted your job title. And also he represents San Mateo. But what's of special interest, he has made the whole issue of climate change and adaptation very much a priority. And the past few days, partly as the sea level rise work I was working on is concluded, but also with this panel approaching, I've heard from a number of people in the environmental community urging me to talk about all the great work that Assemblymember Mullen is doing and how he is definitely the one who needs to give the governor a nudge in terms of some of the budget priorities in the months to come, but I suspect we'll talk about that. And finally, we will be hearing from Amy Worth, who chairs the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, and she is the former head of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. She's been on the Orinda City Council for a number of years, currently mayor of Orinda, but as someone who in a prior life at the Chronicle was the Contra Costa columnist back when we had regional editions, I can say that nobody cares about the Bay Area more thoroughly and thoughtfully and magnanimously than Amy does. So I think that this is a terrific panel, and I look forward to hearing the presentations in the next few minutes. And I'm sorry, I'm really apologize. And we will start with the congressman. And who apparently is not here, so we will now go to the Assembly Member Mullen.
All right, John. I'll pinch hit to lead us off here for the congressman while we wait for him. But great to be with all of you, John. I'm a fan. I'm a lifelong Chronicle subscriber. I still get the hard copy of the paper. I guess that's kind of old school now. But
you'll see the seawall thing on. You'll see the sea level rise piece on Sunday.
Awesome. Look forward to it. And Amy, my good friend, when I was cutting my teeth on the MTC, great to see you, Amy. I was a rookie, and she kind of helped me navigate the waters at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and learned quite a bit about regional governance with Amy's help. So great to be with all of you, and certainly look forward to hearing from the congressman as well. Thank you to the Bay Planning Coalition for the invitation. We've worked with BPC on some of our work with the Bay Conservation and Development Commission and some of the regional issues that we have. So honored to be with all of you. I was asked to talk a little bit about what's happening at the state level on climate resilience and some regional adaptation legislative work that we're doing. So the topic of the panel is definitely of particular importance to me. Given my district's vulnerability, John mentioned that I'm the assembly member from San Mateo County. Just my county alone has $24 billion in property value at risk with sea level rise. So, and by the way, I just saw the congressman come online, and I'm more than happy to defer if the congressman would like to lead us off in case he's got a tight schedule. I've got a pretty open morning. We just did our House of Origin deadline. All of our bills are out of our house, so I'm at home today, and I've got a pretty free schedule. So John, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear from the congressman first, and then I'll jump in after.
Okay, no, that sounds great. We'll start national and work methodically toward local.
Great.
Methodically. So do you want me to just jump in?
I started by saying we know you best as the former head of TRs in Concord, but I was bringing them up to date that since you left the restaurant, you've gone on to other things.
Sorry, that was a relatively stress-free career, the restaurant business. Well, I apologize for being late. One of the phenomenons of COVID in Congress is that Friday mornings are busy because East Coast members want to get on at their weekend, and it's noontime on the East Coast. And when I started this morning, it was 9 in the morning on the East Coast, so 6 o'clock here in paradise. I just want to thank you for the time, Kevin. It's wonderful to see you. I bring back lots of fond memories. I'm really sorry about your dad. What a remarkable man and friend, and a great teacher on so many levels. So he was a great mentor to me when I got elected to the assembly. And Amy Worth, I don't know who you are. I hear you're chair of something called BARC. Who came up with that acronym? Boy, talk about a masochist. Jeez. Well, thank you for having me. And I do have an education and labor Democratic meeting to attend, so I probably hop off and then try to come back on if that's okay. But it's exciting. Actually, today, our staff received the framework of reauthorization, but also infrastructure. So I'm really looking forward to looking at that. We had a T&I, Transportation Infrastructure Democratic meeting yesterday with Chair DeFazio, who I have a really nice friendship with. I brought him to the Bay Area now multiple times. Bay Area Council has been great at a hosting event for him. Jim Wonderman, and also took him in a helicopter ride over the Bay Area to show him our transportation challenges. This is pre-COVID. And I took him up at peak period. Excuse me. So it's funny, Peter came to San Francisco about the same time I did in the 70s. And we were laughing in the helicopter. I said, "Why did you leave for Oregon?" He said, "It was too crowded." And I was like, "Well, there's a couple million more people here now." So it's exciting. We're going to have, my own belief is that we're hoping to have one vehicle that's agreed to by Republicans and Senator McConnell in particular. That'll be more traditional infrastructure. And I'm going to guess that's order of magnitude $300 to $500 billion. A lot of the argument now is what's new money and what's counting money twice. Excuse me, my allergies are bothering me. So we'll have that. And of course, the president will sign that. And then I think president indicated in the administration yesterday, not the president, but the administration, that we'll have a bigger package that we'll use through reconciliation. And that will include a up-to-date definition of infrastructure. The definition of infrastructure I like is it's the investment you make to enable productive workers. 30 years ago, that was different. It was a single family, a single house, a single job in a single career in one household, with that second person, the woman, staying at home and raising a family. My Republican colleagues seem to think that we're in some kind of time warp. We want to go back to that for better and I won't say for worse, because it's not for worse. This times has evolved, and two incomes in the workforce have been exponentially beneficial to all of us. And having women in the workforce in positions of leadership, I think, has been exponentially beneficial to society and American society and the economy. So we've never provided the infrastructure. The rest of the industrialized world has. Primarily the Europeans. There's a wonderful book that's probably 15, 20 years old now called Perfect Madness. And it's about somebody who worked for the Clinton administration and Hillary Clinton and then left Washington with newborns to work at a job in Europe. And she just compares the infrastructure. And in this instance, I think in particular, early education. And we know, I spent a lot of time on the education committee on this. And Kevin, you and your dad spent a lot of time on these issues too. What we know about cognitive development and neuroscience now for young people is getting quality early education is the right thing to do. So that's going to be in the infrastructure bill. On the other end of demographics, because of, again, the sociological changes with diffused families, and of course we know that in the Bay Area. Grandparents and older parents don't have the family members that we had a generation or two ago to support them. So we've got to figure out how we do that. And there's going to be significant money to do that for quality care for elders in their home as much as possible. And those are the right things to do on multiple levels. So we don't have agreement with our colleagues on that. I think it's largely a political argument, and it's very reflective of our cultures in the two parties right now. But certainly for the Bay Area, we get it. We know, and we're going to keep the economy we have. We have to pay for this infrastructure, and employers get that. To attract and retain the best and the brightest for our economy, you have to provide this as infrastructure. So I'm excited, and I think that second bill will be order of magnitude. This is purely a guess on my part, around the 2 trillion in new money expenditures over a period of time, obviously. So very, very excited. One thing about that that's important to me, there's a lot in here for climate change, renewables, and alternative fuels. Amy's been involved in some of these discussions I've had. I've worked for a couple of years on how do you transition a district like mine in the Bay Area that Contra Costa County has 4 of the 13 refineries left. Thanks to Lonnie Hancock when she was in the legislature. Kevin, I think you voted for the bill SB 54. Those are really good paying jobs in the refineries. We don't want to leave those people behind. So we've been convening meetings, and they're tough. And I think it's a national model. We in the Bay Area are leading the country and the world in changing our energy source. But for the people who make good money on the current system, we have to be smart about it, and we have to bring them along. And we have to bring them along because we have a model with them, and that's the renewable portfolio standard that's continued to be an example for the whole world that we're transitioning to, that turns out to be the right economic investment. So cars in the mobile fleet and their fuel is more complicated. We always knew that, but it's really important. So I will end there. Kevin, thank you so much for letting me interrupt you. And Amy, thank you for patiently listening to me. You listen to me as a good neighbor. So, and then everybody else, thanks for inviting me. And I look forward to questions.
And now back to Assemblyman Mullen.
Thank you, Johnny. Great to see you. Great to see you, Mark. And thank you so much for your kind words about my dad. And you should know that you're one of my Bay Area political heroes, and my mentor, Jackie Spear, thinks the world of you. And it's just an honor to serve on the same panel with you here for the Bay Planning Coalition, and great to see you. And don't feel bad if you have to hop off to get back to committee. I know what that's all about probably too well, but thank you so much for the invitation to the Bay Planning Coalition. And it was great to hear the work that's being done on the federal level. It seems like there's an extraordinary opportunity here with the budget surplus we have in California, the unexpected surplus. Mark knows all about the volatility of our tax structure in California, but it's manna from heaven right now compared to a $54 billion deficit, which we thought we were going to be dealing with, to actually have some money to work with. And then also to hear what's happening on the federal level with regard to infrastructure and climate. But I was asked to just give a little overview on what's happening at the state level with climate resilience, a specific focus on just one of my bills. I don't want to make this a promotional video for one of my bills, but it is a centerpiece in terms of regional climate adaptation planning. So I think I was primarily asked to speak today because I'm the author, a joint author, along with a colleague of mine, Eduardo Garcia from Southern California, on a climate bond, a $7 billion climate resilience bond for the 2022 ballot, which we introduced before we knew we had a $75 billion surplus. So that has sort of complicated the conversations around climate bond. But just to give you a sense of what's happening there, there's a bond in the Assembly side as well as the Senate side. So both houses have a climate resilience bond moving, and there's quite a bit of momentum around this conversation. Even with COVID and the economic recovery, there's an urgency around doing something big on climate. Even with that, though, truth be told, $7 billion is a very, very modest down payment when you're talking about, 24 billion at risk just in my county. There are 20 billion in needs around the Bay Area. So this would be a down payment on making the Bay Area more climate resilient. But given the unprecedented budget surplus we have in Sacramento, I mentioned the $75 billion figure. About half of that will go to deal with Proposition 98 requirements, the education funding, as well as rainy day fund replenishment and replenishing the reserves. But there's still about 35 billion or so in terms of discretionary funds. And we're hoping a chunk of that can be devoted for climate resilience. So the two bond measures have been catalysts for examining how, when we have the money, we tend to fund smaller scale adaptation projects that simply don't give us the resilience bang for our buck that big regional scale projects could. So a big reason for this is that we simply don't know what these regional scale projects are because many local governments doing adaptation planning haven't been coordinating their plans with other entities around the Bay, for example, and some haven't even begun doing any adaptation planning. Areas of the state are behind in this regard. So I've got a measure moving AB 897. So the reality of the sort of lack of coordinated planning, along with an LAO, legislative analyst report on sea level rise, recommended that the state establish and support regional climate adaptation collaborative groups. That's a mouthful, but also supporting the development of regional coastal adaptation plans and the implementation of regional adaptation efforts motivated me to introduce that bill. The bill takes the LAO's recommendations one step further by encouraging regional planning across all regions of California and adaptation planning for all types of climate risk, in addition to sea level rise. So specifically, the bill seeks to encourage and support regional climate adaptation planning that builds upon and enhances local adaptation actions to reduce climate risk, foster collaboration among local, regional, and state entities on adaptation solutions, and develop guidance for potential state, federal, or private investment in funding regional priority adaptation projects across the state. But I mentioned the budget, and this brings me to this surplus we have and how it sort of changed the conversation. I mentioned earlier, half of that money goes to Prop 98. But 35 billion or so in discretionary. This was really a shock to all of us that we had this money. You know, California is very dependent on capital gains and wealthy income earners who've been doing just fine, even though the pandemic has really hit middle income and lower income workers. But so not only do we have this surplus in the state, but we're also receiving 27 billion from our federal partners, which could potentially turn into a more like a green infrastructure package from Congress. So there really is a moment here that is happening, and taking all of that into consideration, the legislature had to take a good look at those bond proposals and whether it made financial sense to continue to move forward with those. We are going to move forward with the bonds because the reality is, you know, we're not dealing with the scale of the problem. Even if we do say 3.7 billion in budget funding, and that's the number we're looking at, a $3.75 billion agreement between the Assembly and the Senate. We still have to work with the governor on that, but there is still a need for bond funding potentially down the road, even with the surplus we have. And then we're also very encouraged about what we're hearing on the federal level. So even as we speak, and Congressman DeSaulnier remembers this date very well, by June 15th, we will have to have a budget agreement. The reality is we're dealing with this surplus, and it's actually going to take quite a while to figure out all of the details on how to spend some of that money. So a bunch of the detail will come later in the budget trailer bills that we'll be dealing with over the summer. We go on summer break. We're probably dealing with what are called trailer bills all the way up to the end of our session to deal with that. But we have an essential sort of framework with the Assembly and the Senate, 3.75 billion on climate resilience. And we're sort of working through some of those details even as we speak. But I've been an advocate for funding these regional adaptation projects, a focus on natural solutions, wetlands restoration, and we'll certainly need our federal partners to help us fund wetlands restoration around the Bay. Here in San Mateo County, not only do we have the oceanside issues and seawall issues with Pacifica, we've also got the bayside issues as well. So what I wanted to mention before I turn it back to John, just a note about how in reality the 3.7 billion is a modest investment, a down payment, a small down payment, really, and what we need to do to make the Bay truly resilient. I did want to touch briefly, and then I'll turn it back. Another Bay Area specific issue is the inclusion of something called under-resourced communities. We have the disadvantaged communities definition and Cal and Virus Screen, and the Bay Area, because of some of the wealth we have in the Bay Area, is really not able to access funding in a variety of ways. So we're not displacing or taking out the disadvantaged communities definition, but we're adding a definition called under-resourced communities, which takes into account the cost of living we have in the Bay Area. So we're sort of layering on another formula into how money gets distributed. And we think that can be very helpful to the Bay Area. So we are at a disadvantage because of the cost of living, really, in the way money gets distributed. So I'll just close by saying I'm hopeful for the 3 Bs. I call them the 3 Bs, which is the budget, this surplus we have, and being able to access money in the current year and in the next couple of years, which portend to be good budget years, thankfully. The second B is the bond, because these projects, I think many of them are more appropriately financed by a bond, because there are future beneficiaries of these projects who can help pay for these projects when you do bond financing. And the third B is Biden, which is really shorthand for the infrastructure package, which the congressman was talking about, just making the connection between climate resilience, economic recovery, green jobs, positioning California. This is a California friendly federal administration, thankfully. And finally, they understand the unique issues we have in California. So I am excited. There's an extraordinary opportunity here with the surplus, with the momentum we have politically on climate, and then with the congressman's help and our federal partners who understand these needs. There's an extraordinary moment here for the Bay Area to prepare itself for climate change and all that is to come. So I'm going to leave it on that optimistic note and look forward to any questions you have. And again, great to be with all of you today.
And before the congressman starts writing checks on behalf of Washington to California, we will hear from Amy Worth.
I'm unmuted. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I just really want to say what it's an honor to be together with all of you. And to, wait a minute, okay. Sorry, little technology. I can relate, John. I'm not at home. I'm in it traveling. So I'm in the corner of a hotel and hopefully it'll be quiet for a few minutes. But I just wanted to say what a joy it is for me to be on this panel with my longtime friends. I don't know of 3 people who have been more engaged in regional planning in the welfare of our Bay Area than, Mark, Kevin, and John. And I think I remember first meeting John King at TR's, as a matter of fact. We were at Mark had a fundraiser for his dear friend, Jim Kellogg, and we were in the back of the room and started chatting. And then over time, when the Chronicle was promoting John's column in Contra Costa County, they went all out, and they had a billboard, a John King billboard. I said to John, "You're the only person I know that has ever had a billboard."
King of the county.
What?
King of the county. That was the
King of the county. That was exactly right. And such an honor to work with Assemblymember Mullen on MTC, and thanks for your kind words. And it's great to be able to have, the cell phones for Assemblymember Mullen and Congressman DeSaulnier. If we need help in the Bay Area, we can call on them. And the fact that Mark is on the Transportation Committee means so much to us in terms of the work we're dealing with transportation and infrastructure and regional planning. So I just want to thank you all and thank the Bay Planning Coalition for all your work over the decades. In preparing for this, I spent some time looking at the history of the Bay Planning Coalition, and really one of the early organizations and efforts recognizing that these issues span county lines and city lines and span over the water. And it was sort of like ABAG, which was created over 60 years ago in recognition that with 101 cities and 9 counties, we need a structure to be able to.
After what the congressman just said, the Joint Economic Committee just issued a report, Don.
Whoops. Oh, are we good? Okay.
We're good.
Great. Okay. Anyway, you know, so how important it is, and, you know, we're not like London or Tokyo where you have one government that can make unilateral decisions. Really, all the work we do is bringing all the counties and the cities together to do this collective goal. And, you know, resilience is a long been a planning priority for MTC, Caltrans, and our many other partners. With, as you know, our knowledge about the various threats facing the Bay Area has evolved over the years, and so has the Commission's planning regarding resilience. You know, regionally, we work to make sure that the Bay Area transportation system, especially the state's toll bridges, can withstand a major earthquake. That's been a major focus of MTC for decades. But the Commission has also widened its resilience portfolio to include wildfires and sea level rise. And, you know, one of the challenges is that unlike earthquakes or wildfires, which strike suddenly and largely without warning, the threat of sea level rise is a completely different kind of challenge for the Bay Area, you know, one that evolves slowly and is constantly creeping up on us. And, you know, when you think about the transportation network and how it relates to the Bay, whether it's airports, rail, or freeway lines, or water treatment facilities, you know, they're all along the Bay and will be impacted by sea level rise. So we need to address these issues of crisis and resiliency, I believe, with a sustained sense of urgency. And I think, you know, that's one of the things that John, you've pointed out in your columns, and the challenge that, you know, sea level rise is a slow thing, and there's always something that distracts us from that long-term goal. And I think that's why it's really incumbent upon all of us to keep the issue of resilience on the forefront and address it with really a sense of urgency. And as we know, regional government and decision-making can be a challenge because it does involve many different players with often conflicting priorities. But it's really important that we do it because issues such as housing, transportation, the environment, and the economy really touch us all. And it's great to be on this panel with Congressman DeSaulnier. You know, we're talking about regional cooperation. Well, he was there at the beginning. And Mark, if you can believe it, it's been 18 years ago that you were instrumental in the passage of SB 849, which really brought together ABAG and MTC, as well as other, you know, all the regional agencies to create what was originally called the Joint Policy Committee. And then the group came up with the Bay, you know, Area region, you know, the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, which is shortened for BARC. I think Cindy Chavez takes credit for that, but I'm not sure. And she kind of rolls her eyes when she says it, but I do think that it's, you know, it's been a great partnership, and as it's evolved since that, since 18 years ago, really, I think the group began to focus early on the whole issue. The core of our work is a plan for rising seas. So that's, you know, really saying this is an issue that affects all of our agencies. Let's focus on this as we move together and do regional planning, comparing our plans and where we're headed. The group also includes BARC. BARC includes Caltrans, the Regional Water Quality Control Commission, as well as the Coastal Conservancy. So with help from a Caltrans planning grant, last year, BARC issued a report known as Adapting to the Rising Tides Bay Area that really provides a foundation for understanding and addressing this interconnected risks that flooding and sea level rise pose to our communities and transportation systems. And I think one of the important aspects of that report is it really gives cities and counties a close understanding of how this issue, this sort of broad global issue, affects their lives, affects their residents, how they get to work, how freight moves, where people live. So I think that's been that was a big part of our effort to say, okay, this is how this relates to counties and cities. So building on this foundation, the latest iteration of MTC and ABAG's long-range strategic plan, which is the draft Plan Bay Area, was just released last week. It really charts a course to allow our 9 counties and 101 cities to grow while meeting, transportation, housing, and environmental challenges that we expect to face through 2050. And that seems like a long way away, but it's just around the corner. And the cost for this plan is about $1.4 trillion with a T. So, and at the heart of our efforts, I think Assemblymember Mullen mentioned this also, is the importance of equity as we implement our programs and projects. All these, this plan has goals, strategies, and programs. And actually, we just released the final draft last week. We have a month-long comment period. So those of you that are on this at this summit today, I'd really encourage you to take a look at this, the plan from, it's on the MTC website, and take the opportunity to provide comment on the plan, because we would, you're all experts and really committed to the Bay, and it would be really helpful to have your comments. So I just wanted to spotlight Plan Bay Area 2050, because it is the first long-range regional plan that really puts resilience front and center. And at the very top of the list of environmental strategies is the adapt to sea level rise. So one of the ways to help execute this strategy, of course, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And again, thanks to Congressman DeSaulnier, who during his time in the Senate made this law. But in addition to meeting these state mandates for cutting emissions, the plan also calls for a coordinated regional program, a mix of man-made gray infrastructure and natural green infrastructure. And as Kevin talked about the state initiatives, the goal is to provide the funding and the incentives to put these investments into place. And of special priority, we're identifying low cost and high benefit solutions, and in support for vulnerable low-income communities also along the Bay shoreline. So the plan's emphasis is on nature-based interventions where possible, and they include cultivating more underwater vegetation, nearshore reefs, promoting beach nourishment, restoring 100,000 acres of marshes, and creating gently sloped levees. So in addition to the green infrastructure where we can't do that, of course, there's funding for things like seawalls in areas such as the Embarcadero, where you have, the walking and roads and buildings so close right on the bay. It also calls for elevating infrastructure in some of our areas. And there has been a kind of a really important effort on Highway 37, which is, there's been a joint planning process has been created with all of the cities and counties that are involved in that corridor. And these approaches are really important for not only Highway 37, but US 101 in the North Bay and 101 on the peninsula, as well as the rail lines that are on the East Bay. So, and I know that John King has done a lot of reporting on efforts to meet the flooding and congestion challenges facing Highway 37 in particular. So we look forward to working together regionally with Caltrans and Marana, Napa, Solano. So, just as Plan Bay Area 2050 can trace some of its roots to the Bay Area's regional collaboratives adapting rising tides, so does some of the planning work is being done by BCDC. And they are taking the lead on their project called Bay Adapt. And the purpose of Bay Adapt is simple: to find the right answers to these questions that are the most important actions need to be taken to adapt faster, better, and more equitably to the rising sea levels. So, and the priority order. So the other thing too is to remind us of the Bay Restoration Authority and those projects that the voters approved, which will again go a long way in terms of addressing sea level rise in the Bay Area. And the other thing, we're really lucky in this Bay Area, we have our laboratory for all of the scholars at the great universities in the Bay Area. They're doing cutting edge work on issues of resilience and sea level rise, and many of the ideas that they are developing way ahead of the rest of the world, we are really able to implement in the Bay Area. as just in closing, I really want to thank the state and our state and federal partners. And we are very excited to be supporting and advocating strongly for Assembly members Mullins legislation with regards to resiliency, as well as Congressman DeSaulnier's work on the transportation authority. And I think he's really right. And when we look at long-range planning, when we look at the economy of our region, we have to be incredibly mindful of people who are working in industries that may evolve and change. And it's very important that we look to the future to create new jobs that accommodate a lot of these changing realities. So, as Controller Yee mentioned earlier in her talk, this is a real opportunity. The funding is coming into these plans. I think this is the first time that the state legislature has really put in significant dollars that the Bay Area is able to utilize in terms of making the goals of Senate Bill 375 really come alive. So, we also are beset with a huge housing crisis. As you know, many of those houses are along the Bay. And so retaining those homes is extremely important and a priority for our region. So while we've learned a lot through these interconnected risks through the adapting to rising tides and other projects, it's really important to remember that we still have so much to do. And by the Bay Area's planning efforts, we are able to have shovel-ready projects so that when Assemblymember Mullins' bills pass, when the voters approve the bond, when our federal legislation comes to fruition, we will have these projects ready to go. So I just want to, again, thank you all for your work, and I'm always reminded that as we look to the future, we know the cost of doing nothing is something that the Bay Area cannot afford. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and thanks to all three of you. And I want to start the conversation by stepping into a word that in different ways bounced up in all three of your talks, and that is the question of priorities. And at the national level, it can turn on something like the definition of infrastructure. I think at the state and local level, it starts to come down to, even if there is some money available, or even if there's a lot of money available right now, I would guess all of you in different ways meet the question, why should we put money into something called resiliency when we have homelessness, we have a messed up transportation system, we have a housing crisis, we have crime problems, we have drug problems? I'm kind of curious for each of you, two questions. First of all, how do you make the case that this, climate change adaptation and resilience is a pressing issue, even if it's not an earthquake that could hit, by the time I finish this sentence? And then the other question is, when you make that case, and this gets into something Amy touched on a bit, that is a huge issue, and Kevin also talked about it. How do we prioritize things? Something like Highway 37 in the North Bay is hugely at risk, but it carries a lot less traffic in terms of cars than Highway 101. How do you divvy up the pot and decide where to spend money? So I apologize for a broad question, but I think there's a good conversation, which is, how do we make a slow-moving set of issues urgent? And then how do we decide what to address first and how to do it? And anyone who wants to step in and kind of get things going.
I'll jump in here, John. It's delightful to see you. It's nice to see somebody who's employed by a newspaper. As somebody
we still call it a paper, or at least I do and you do.
Well, yeah, but one of the few sources who got along with Phil Matier, I still communicate with him, and sorry he's gone. And of course, John Diaz, what a loss that was from my perspective. When I talked to him when he retired, he said, I don't remember ever writing a negative editorial about you. And I said, well, that's not why I respect you. But it's really wonderful to see you, John, and great panel. So this is interrelated to your profession. Good news is more people are involved, certainly at the national level, in politics. The bad news is the sound bites continue to, even more so probably, drive a lot of the discussion on social media and on national news. And I would say local news too. This country has been able to do multiple things and prioritize multiple things, particularly at moments of challenge, like right now, whether it was the 2 world wars, the Depression. And it's part of the, in my view, part of the genius of Madison and how our government has evolved. And you've got it in front of you between Amy, Kevin, and I. There are multiple levels of government, and that can be bad, sometimes frustrating. But to this issue, if you attract serious people to public service, both as staff people and as elected, they choose areas of expertise, they become more involved, they become more knowledgeable, they can communicate it. And so to your point, we can and we do prioritize. I had a bill early on in the legislature that actually was defeated by a lot of urban Democrats that would require MPOs to prioritize at least their larger projects. And it was defeated. I was on the floor watching it get defeated by a lot of colleagues from good progressive Democrats from the Northeast. And, this is one of the challenges I think San Francisco has always had, is that those old political relationships, particularly when it comes to infrastructure, are endemic and generational. And when you look at the rest of the world, they've gotten away from that. It's just engineering performance standards, and then you analyze the other consequences. So we're moving people in transportation, but how does that affect education? How does that affect employment? Mega commutes, sea level rise, air quality, all these things could be done, and we have the infrastructure to do it. I just think the more we move towards the refinement of modeling, which we're doing, and Amy and Therese McMillan are MPOs are changing as we speak in the Bay Area to be more like other big MPOs, mostly in Europe and also in Asia. I think we can do all of these things. But in terms of the political discourse, it becomes whatever drives advertising and the amygdala and gets people excited. So it's harder to get people excited about 30, 40, 50 years of climate change than an earthquake. But having said that, we've got people's attention here in Northern California because of the change in weather and fire. And we've also gotten Republicans' attention in the Gulf Coast because of their deferred investment in their infrastructure and their weather changes around hurricanes and dramatic storms. So I think we can do all of this, and we have to. But it has to be driven by the science. And I'm hopeful that our political discussions get more driven by the engineering and the science that informs us and helps to inoculate us against sort of silly political opinions that are made to divide people and distract people from these serious problems.
If I could just jump on that, because Mark touched on so many key things there. The science-based approach, we have been sort of adamant in our conversations that if we're going to do a bond, we're going to do funding, these projects have to be based in real science and have actual bang for the buck, that there's a regional planning process where projects based on their merit elevate in the conversation, and it's not just a political sort of wrangling. So, there's always politics involved. It looks like earmarks are kind of getting momentum again on the federal level. So there's always that kind of push-pull, but to the extent that you can make it science-based and really incentivize regional planning and have real projects that really make an impact in making the Bay Area more resilient, elevate. And then when the money comes, those projects get properly funded, but they're based in science. So it's such an important point. And just on the urgency, John, this is a great question, because you are talking about something that is sort of a rolling, kind of looming disaster. But in reality, there is an urgency here. You all remember the day that the sun basically did not come out in the Bay Area. That was the eeriest day in my 51 years living in the Bay Area. The threat of wildfires is real. We're in a drought. It's going to be another, you can almost bank on it that it's going to be a terrible fire season. These climate related crises are in our face, and they are in Republican areas, like the congressman indicated. These challenges are now crossing political boundaries, crossing geographic boundaries. So the climate challenge is becoming very real and very immediate. And then you also marry that with the fact that you have resources and you have some political alignment to actually put money in to these kinds of things. And you do have a kind of that moment at our doorstep here.
Yeah, you know, I think just jumping into, I think that, you know, Kevin and Mark have really pointed out, you know, both at the federal level and the state, how this is a confluence of ideas, you know, and living in the East Bay, you know, we are terrified of wildfire. I mean, we've obviously very close to us, and certainly my own community of Orinda is, you know, in the Bates High Fire District, as you all know. But what was interesting is Cal Fire recently had their big, and state OES, so their big press conference, and they had it over in Orinda in the East Bay. And what is exciting and about what they're doing is that they are funding work to do innovation with regards to wildfire safety and resilience and prevention. And when you hear and it's really encouraging to see that the state funds are now coming forward to be able to fund that. But John, the other point you made, which is an interesting one, about how do you set the priorities for these various transportation projects. And as you know, in the Bay Area, we have a number of them. They're mega projects. They require like a layer cake. They require multiple areas of funding. And Highway 37 is really an interesting example of how I think moving forward we can be looking at these issues. Is that it definitely, it's not the high population areas that some of the other commute sheds are. However, the North Bay is vitally important to our sea level rise issue on the bay. So when the group is planning the Highway 37 as you know, investments, they are incorporating the green infrastructure for sea level rise for the entire bay. When you look at the bay from, you know, 30,000 feet, you realize how important the North Bay is in terms of mitigating sea level rise. So, you know, I think those are some of the other things about how you're seeing innovative planning. And thank you, Mark, for your compliment about MTC. I know that that's been one of the congressman's priorities for decades, is how we as the Bay Area can do planning and best practices, and really look to some of our European and, you know, other partners that are doing a lot. And certainly in terms of climate awareness, I think that the Europeans have really, you know, stepped forward and helped us learn a lot. So I do think that we are changing, we're including resiliency as one of the elements in our transportation planning and housing planning. And so that in itself kind of wraps these efforts into programs and projects that are going to be funded.
I want to follow up, kind of keeping this discussion going, because I think it's important, and kind of tagging back to something that the Assembly member talked about. I mean, it's interesting. As a journalist, I'm very aware of words that everybody at a group like this knows and embraces and nods and everything, and the general public doesn't know. And I think something like resiliency has tended to be that. It has come in the really has come into vogue in the last 10 years or so, but I don't know how much it bubbles out to the general public. But but we all know what a wildfire is. We all know what the devastation wrought on the town of Paradise is. I mean, is the urgency coupled with, basically, is it easier now to make the case for long-term proactive spending because we can see what can happen? It's sea level rise is different, yes, but we know about Katrina. climate change is amorphous, but the North, we didn't have a fire. I grew up in the Bay Area. We didn't have a fire season here until a few years ago. We had occasionally really bad fires. I mean, how is this moment different for all of you?
So if I might, just because as you were describing that, John, I remember sitting through a polling session around our bond proposals, and essentially the public is not so aware of what climate resilience is, but wildfire. And it was right, frankly, the poll was done right in the middle of one of our historically bad wildfire seasons, which are apparently year round now. I mean, I'm a San Mateo County lifer. I remember when San Mateo County was not wildfire country. It is now. Just in my lifetime, I've seen that evolution. So the use of language is so crucial when you're trying to sell something to the public. I guess candidly, it's a little easier when we're sort of in this internal capital budget process to develop a climate resilience package. If we had to go to the public and get the voters to support this, certainly the political environment you're in, the kind of budget environment you're in is important, but also the language you use. And if we actually got to the point where it went to the ballot, we probably would lead with wildfire because the election was probably going to happen in November, and that was going to be smack dab in the middle of the fall wildfire season. So I don't have a great answer on that other than there's an awareness about resilience, but we really need to kind of make this real for people in terms of what sea level rise would mean. And I like to throw around numbers like 24 billion in property value at risk. Well, but if you start talking about, that trailer park near Bear Island and the airport that you all are aware of, and these biotech companies that employ a lot of people are in the inundation zone, and they are at risk. You have to sort of make it real for people, like what truly is at risk, as opposed to just sort of numbers and fancy words like resilience. And you heard my mouthful about climate adaptation planning. It sounds good in a bill, but it's you need to be able to translate that so the public actually understands, what the heck you're talking about here.
And how does that work at the national level?
What you said, work at the national level?
In other words,
I'm sorry, we're talking about language here, and as you know, I'm a little dim-witted, John. If you said, how does that work in Congress? That's an oxymoron.
Right.
Well, seriously, you mentioned Katrina. I mean, when Katrina happened, I think I was a local representative and I was on the State Air Resources Board, and dealing with our scientists years ago, telling us, those great scientists who advise Cal EPA and the legislature and CARB, saying, hey, this is a problem, this is what we've got to do with. And we were in many ways, we were certainly leading the country and ahead of US EPA. But I remember Katrina and sort of the same thing. When is the general public going to start realizing there's a transformational thing happening here? And back in the days when we had magazines, I think it was something called Look Magazine had a picture of an American floating who had drowned in Katrina in a major US city, if you remember that. And I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, this is going to change things. And it did a little bit, but it goes to what Kevin was talking about, and you too, John, and Amy's talked about this, is in the political discourse, we're in a pretty, I think this is unparalleled time. There's a wonderful new book by a Smithsonian curator called The Age of Acrimony, about post-Civil War with the Telegraph and very partisan newspapers across the country, and the immediacy of that information and steam and a lot of immigration, and how similar that time was to this, and political discourse. And Congress and state legislatures were unfortunately very divisive then. And it was now, in looking back 100 years, it's pretty obvious that it was how people getting information. So you are appropriately asking about language and information and how that drives policy. We're in a period that is order of magnitude, in my view, much more intense than this book talks about. The availability of information, the credibility of information, how people choose sources, and what they believe. And this is, we're in the midst of this historically figuring this out. A more serious concern is cognitive development and how people's brains, actually a lot of great research, start to use their flexibility, particularly young people, to problem solve. And for Amy and Kevin and I think we're generalists who know our role in government, but are very engaged and are good liberal arts folks. And we realize that expertise at the staff level that is refined and career driven. This goes to your previous question, but I think it's interesting about how do you prioritize and then how do you articulate this so that you have momentum from the public. And Nancy Speaker Pelosi likes to quote the great Lincoln quote that says, with public sentiment, anything is possible. Without it, no statute or law really has effect. And that's sort of gets to your question is language, how people get information, and how in a democracy you get the gestalt of people coming together and then investing in things that are important, particularly complex issues, where oftentimes I find, and I don't know if Amy and Kevin find this, but if you start the conversation as an elected official saying, you know, this is complicated. Half of the audience goes, oh, he's trying to obscure his response. It's like, no, seriously, it's complicated. So it's a fascinating question. I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. This is just sort of observational, and I'd be curious about your observation in your career. And you know, you've been a generalist, but you've been a specialist as a journalist, and the challenges in your industry to have professional integrity and provide quality information that's a longer dialogue and complex, but do it in such a way that's digestible. And the digestible part is getting our political digestive system is becoming shorter and shorter at a time when we need people to recognize that you need serious people on complex issues for multiple generations if you're going to get the desired results.
It is tricky because the mayor was talking about Planned Bay Area, and that's the type of thing that takes a lot of time to look at. It's the kind of thing that certainly got written about more when newspapers had much larger staffs and there were more newspapers. So you all, back when I was in knee pants and my hair was bobbing around jet black, I was covering the Planned Bay Area effort.
I remember that,
regional
John.
government that went nowhere.
And we know that required medication for everybody who participated.
I was fascinated by it.
But I know you didn't inhale, John.
But it's funny though, because every paper was covering the meetings of the Planned Bay Area Committee. And it is tough because newspapers certainly have flaws and have always had flaws, but there is a difference in how information goes out when someone's methodically turning the pages, as opposed to going to a site and choosing which thing to click on, because what you don't click on, you never see or read, as opposed to kind of coming across some information. So it is very tricky. But Amy, do you want to add anything, or should we go?
Well, I just had a couple of thoughts to pick up and sort of how this ties to what we're doing locally. First of all, I think the point that we have to have credibility with our voters, and our residents. And that's why I think the point earlier about the science-based analysis is really important as we move forward. And that's why I'm very excited about the work that BCDC is doing right now on the Bay Adapt plan. Because what they will do is approach it from a scientific, environmental standpoint, and then, develop the report and release it to the public. And I do think that, and of course, all of these planning processes have the ability for the public to weigh in. I mentioned earlier about Planned Bay Area, the one month comment period right now. And that's actually one of the things about Zoom is more people are engaged in this public process. So these projects now incorporate this resilience element to them. So the ones that have this kind of rise to the top, but it is, as Mark said, it's kind of a gestalt. You know, being a democracy, we don't have one person at the top who makes these decisions. It is very much a collective process. And, you know, I think to the fact that if voters, and I focus on voters because a lot of this is going to the ballot to get funding to do the important work. You know, Kevin's, and we look forward to working with him on this, on the you know, resiliency bond. But, you know, think about it, Measure A, which, you know, helping the Bay restoration efforts, got 70% on a tax measure in the Bay Area. So I think that's a sign that the Bay Area really understands this issue. And that was even really before the wildfires were part of the picture. So what's good about it, and that's the other thing I think that, you know, and it is tragic that, you know, how the media has changed in terms of particularly newspapers. You know, my grandfather was a newspaper editor, so newspapers are near and dear to my heart. And I believe that balanced reporting. And I remember, John, you did a report with one of your many wonderful articles on sea level rise. And in my mind, I remember the photographs that you used to illustrate. It showed the bay, the waves of the bay lapping over the Embarcadero. And it's like, wait a minute, are we surfing or are we walking on this sidewalk? And those kinds of images that people can understand. You know, the other thing in terms of communication, and I know at MTC and ABAG, we put in a lot of resources in communicating with the public. So I think that's the other thing, is that government has the obligation to sort of communicate these stories, these issues, this plan to the public in a way that's balanced and people can, you know, kind of take it and follow it.
We have time for two more questions. And one, I want to pick up on a phrase Amy used earlier, the layer cake. And that's, you know, one thing when we look at these projects, even if there's a lot of consensus behind them, the regulatory process takes years, and then accumulating or assembling the funding can take years, and they're often, they can't even move at a parallel track. The next piece I have coming up in the Sea Level Rise series that's in 2 weeks touches on one project in Marin, and I was talking with the planner. And basically the plan was approved back in the 90s. And, you know, phase 3 is going to start in about 4 years. So are there ways, just a few specific ways to kind of get at some of this the regulatory and funding labyrinth that slows everything down so much? Or is that what we live with?
Yeah, John, I think we can. We had legislation that was bipartisan. Actually, Jeff Denham, former Republican, well, still a Republican, former member of the legislature, and I worked on this, where for a lot of projects, this was from transportation infrastructure, so T&I, and this goes to not just transportation, but all infrastructure, including infrastructure, water infrastructure, is that in a state like California, you've made the argument for the NEPA argument, the National Environmental Protection Agency, if you've done CEQA, because you've already gone further than NEPA. So why have to have this competing? More problematic was getting Fish and Game, and the state agencies and the federal agencies to be in the same. So we're still working on that, but those are specific things that I would say there's bureaucratic creep and politics just inertly into the system that legislatively we have to change, and we can, because the effect of the investment in the public process is already there, particularly in California, where you're exceeding the federal levels. So if state Fish and Game is saying they're okay with the protections, then why does U.S. Fish and Game have to come in with multiple other things at a different point in the argument? And then with the Republican effort in 30 years of not spending money on these agencies, I always thought that there would be a bipartisan opportunity about just making it more efficient, and particularly from the business community. We've had that in California, but we haven't had it very much in the national level. So I think there are great opportunities here. There's some we've moved on, but there's a lot more work to be done. And it's these layers starting to integrate. And there's a great opportunity, I think, in California, because a lot of good work in both Los Angeles and in the Bay Area at integrating this. And this panel is a good example of that. And also having the staff who have longer lifespans than we do, and sometimes come resistant to change because they figure they'll just wait out a governor or they'll wait out an administration at the federal level, and everything will go back, as opposed to questioning why are we doing what we're doing and how effective is it. But the NEPA CEQA thing is a specific example that is still ongoing, even though legislation's been passed, because I still get feedback that there's redundancies. So getting Region 9 to follow the guidelines from DC and then to sustain it through multiple administrations is also a challenge. It shouldn't be.
And how about funding when these individual projects are coming together? You know, for any of you on this.
So one of the things, just to pick up on what Mark was saying, John, and that's part of the role of our regional agencies. And I remember years ago when Jim Gilmetti was appointed to the California Transportation Commission, and he came. Kevin, you remember that? We were in the old building, and Jim came to speak to us, and it was great having him there. You know, it was great. It's always great to have friends in Congress and a friend on the CTC from the Bay Area, so that we can, you know, successfully advocate for the projects. And what he said, I'll never forget that. He said, the Bay Area, you've got to get together and figure out what the priority projects are. And, you know, that's what we do. That's what we do. And we recognize, for especially these mega projects, and I think Mark has done so much work over his career to try to increase the ability to deliver projects and look at the barriers to those, you know, and this whole interplay with NEPA and CEQA. And it, you know, because during the recession, those big projects like the Calicut Tunnel, they were the only jobs around. And those were important, you know, building trades jobs that are, you know, excellent pay, excellent investment. And so it's really important that we look at how we can continue this. So one, working together, figuring out what the priorities are. And there's a sequencing. You know, if you look at the large projects in the Bay Area, everybody sort of takes turns. But the other issue that we need to do now, which we're doing, is we have to have these shovel-ready projects so that when the federal funds and the state funds come into play, the Bay Area is positioned to have these projects that are ready to go. And that's one of the biggest challenges. You know, for the Bay Area, we're competing with Los Angeles. They have a long funding stream. They were able to pass, you know, some of their local transportation measures that provide money in perpetuity. So we've got to be more nimble in the Bay Area. But, you know, one of the great stories about coming together for money, when we had a previous transportation bill in Southern California, the Long Beach port wanted all the money for their infrastructure. Normally, you know, money's spent, Mark, you remember this, 60-40, 60 goes south, 40 goes north based on the population. Well, LA decided that they deserved it all because, you know, every tennis shoe that was coming in the United States was going through Long Beach. Well, the Oakland port is a 50-50 port. Half comes in, but it's vital for California economy because all of our export products go through the Oakland port. So we got together with the San Joaquin farmers and the districts and the, you know, the state, you know, legislators. Mark was part of this. And we got the money that we needed for the Bay region. So you got to also be strategic. And this is why having key people like, you know, like Kevin, like Mark in the positions they is vitally important, because that's, you know, you need that political muscle and those abilities to be able to, you know, so we can compete for these dollars.
Especially, Kevin, when you loosen up the state budget, you turn the spigots at the state budget with this surplus we have, right?
Well, I certainly hope so. I would just say, picking up on Amy's point about sort of the north-south stuff, it is interesting, and Mark has lived this as well. The Bay Area Caucus meets regularly, and we don't have the numbers that LA has, but we have definitely, I think all of us have sort of come up through the ranks with understanding that the spirit of collaboration can't just be like a nice phrase. You actually genuinely have to band together in the 9-county Bay Area, sort of hold firm, fight for your budget priorities. Because you are outnumbered, I think it sort of forces us to be organized and collaborative and strategic on how we go about this. And just as you were describing the projects in the region, I was thinking of SB1, for example, the gas tax increase. I advocated strongly for a managed lane through San Mateo County. I have a good relationship with Brian Kelly, who at the time was our transportation secretary. And that all came to fruition. But I sort of just assumed that was going to be, years off. Yeah. And here this thing is actually being built. It's like, I mean, I was actually kind of stunned at the speed with which this was happening. So there are efforts to speed projects. There are efforts to cut what they call green tape on these environmental kinds of projects, the permitting challenges. There's been so much attention on it. I think, with design build and different ways to approach projects, you are sort of crunching those timelines down a little bit. But look, it's multifaceted, lots of different agencies, lots of different interests. But I actually have seen a good deal of progress on that. And Mark's citing the NEPA CEQA thing. It's a good example of sort of how can we streamline the process here and speed these projects and bring them to fruition. But I see actually quite a bit of progress being made on that front, surprisingly, I guess I would say.
And we have about 3 minutes or so left. I want to thank the audience, the 140 or so of you who stayed with this. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. And I just want to ask, given all the orange skies, the insurrection, all the systemic things going on, what makes each of you hopeful looking at the situation right now tackling climate change? I mean, do each of you see seeds of hope here?
Yeah, I do. Having had a ringside seat for January 6th, I was in a room where off the House floor, I could see them coming towards us. I saw the battle beneath me. Very tough day, but we've been through this before in this country. And I would just say, since we only have 3 minutes, we've got to remember in the Bay Area how unique we are. And I am keenly aware of this. There's an expression in Congress, anyone but California, and it's sort of accelerated towards a lot of people, particularly in the other party, towards Northern California. They both admire us and resent us. But we have the opportunity, the culture, and the responsibility to be transformative. As maddening as we can be, and as frustrating as it can be, we're way ahead of the rest of the country. So these issues we can do, and the work that Amy's doing and Kevin's doing and you're doing, we just got to remember we're leading the country. So I'm very hopeful. We will accomplish this, but it's multiple generations.
Thank you.
I was inclined to say I'd use that as my close. That's a phrase we use on the floor of the assembly. I couldn't agree more. I see seeds of hope there. I share the congressman's apprehension, though, that we're in the middle of a social media information technological revolution, and we're trying to figure it out. Media is under attack. Institutions are under attack. Democracy itself is under attack. That makes me very apprehensive. What makes me hopeful is actually what you're seeing in the Bay Area with the spirit of collaboration and the things that we're leading on in the Bay Area. You just have to be proud of. I'm a lifer, so I'm biased, but I see seeds of real hope around just the Plan Bay Area work, the regional collaboration and coordination, and I'm optimistic. And I'll be a lifer for sure after some of the good stuff I'm seeing on the regional level. So I'll end on that optimistic note.
Well, and I share your optimism. I just want to say one of my favorite things about Facebook is seeing those beautiful Mullen twins grow up. And, it's an illustration of the fact that how important I really think the future is. Us positioning it, working together in partnership, state, federal, and regional and local to implement and fund these programs, but also, the next generation. I really do think that our age group is recognizing these challenges when we see them every day, when we see the fires, we see the flooding, we see the earthquakes. But the second thing is the next generation. You know, there are a group of students in Orinda that are working in their environmental group. And they came to me as mayor and said, listen, we would like our community to ban styrofoam. And in working with them the last few months, it shows me how embedded and how strongly this generation feels about resiliency and climate change, and not only doing what we can do locally and regionally, but in the world. You know, working and again, thanks to the legislature that's doing things like, you know, some of the materials that we need to get out of our environment to. So I do think that there's a huge awareness, and communication is just critical to keep this issue on the forefront. And we're lucky that we do have the scientists that are giving us the good data. But I am optimistic, particularly now. And again, I think it's important that we seize this particular opportunity to move these issues forward in preparation for the next generation that is so enthusiastic and so committed to this.
Thanks to all of you. I'm going to hand this back to the good folks at the Bay Planning Coalition. There are breakout sections afterwards. And I really want to, again, thank everyone in the audience for being here. And I hope that we might miss the congressman, but if there's a recap of this next year, that it's in person so that we can all chuckle about the misadventures of Zoom. So I want to thank all of you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you.
Great to be together. Thank you all.
Thank you. I'm John Coleman. I'm the CEO of the Bay Planning Coalition, and I'd like to first thank all the sponsors who made today's event possible. And also I'd like to let people know that BPC is committed to working towards attracting new funding to the Bay Area and quickly turning those dollars into solutions in order to strengthen our economic climate resilience going forward. I think it's important, what was brought up by Amy and others, that we need a strategic partnership working together, which is going to be required to build a resilient future for the Bay Area. I'm very optimistic after listening to the panelists that we had today, our two speakers to begin with, Betty Yee and Eric Saperstein, and our panelists, and then John King, who did a phenomenal job moderating. If you do not get the San Francisco Chronicle, I would recommend you go online. His first story today on sea level rise. If you look at it online, it's phenomenal how they did the graphics, and he'll have more stories as John talked about, but we're living in a world of sea level rise here in the Bay Area, and we need to fight those challenges in order to move forward. If you're not a member of the Bay Planning Coalition, we encourage you to get involved. We have numerous committees that work collaboratively with policymakers and regulatory agencies on a range of policy issues. And we encourage and we'd like to get you more involved as we go forward in this area. As our panelists noted, the issues of project prioritization will be key when new funding hopefully starts flowing into the region, and we'll see what happens with the infrastructure bill that Eric Saperstein talked about in Washington, D.C. We'll see what happens with the bond measure that Assemblymember Kevin Mullen talked about. Again, working together, we're going to be able to do a lot more than we've done in the past, so I'm very optimistic, as I stated. We're now going to be hosting breakout discussions so we can hear from you about what you think we should be prioritizing in our regions and the opportunities in order to expedite project delivery. The breakout sessions will be short, about 15 minutes long. We'll focus on 4 key areas of infrastructure: sea level rise, transportation, water, ports, and airports. Those who do not want to stay in the breakout session discussion, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you found the content valuable, and we look forward to working with you in order to build a more resilient future for the Bay Area. In order to join the breakout session, you need to go to the chat box on your screen and touch it, and then that link will provide you to go to the webinar, and you can join one of the 4 groups that was mentioned before. Once there, you'll be able to select which topic you'd like to be engaged with. And I'm going to hand this off to Laura Kennedy, but before I do, I want to give huge thanks to the BPC staff, Emily Loper, Roman Bernstein, and Ashley Labasse. Without all their hard work, this would not have happened today. They played a key and critical role making the Spring Summit, I think, a great success that it is. And again, we're going to finish at about 11:30, and I'm going to now turn this over to Laura Kennedy. So thank you very much for joining us today.